My name is Ellie Allen. I'm 33 years old. At my sister's housewarming, her fiancé looked my parents up and down in front of everyone and said, loud enough for the whole kitchen to hear, "You should have left them home. They make this place look cheap." My sister laughed. Then she told our mother, "Please don't make it weird." My father set down his glass without a word. My mother lowered her eyes and quietly apologized for existing. Blake smiled, adjusted his collar, and turned back to his guests like he'd just commented on the weather. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't leave. I waited. I let him finish showing off the house. I let him raise his glass and toast his perfect future. Then I asked one calm question about his employment. The room went silent. And what followed is something none of them, especially him, will ever forget. Before I continue, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story earns it. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I like knowing who's out there. To understand what I said to Blake that night, you have to understand where my parents come from. So let me take you back. I grew up in a small house on the east side of Kansas City, the kind with a chain-link fence and a garage that mattered more than the living room. My father, Wayne, fixed cars for 39 years. Our garage smelled like motor oil and old coffee, and there was a rusted coffee can on the top shelf where he kept loose bills and quarters. Money he always said he was saving for something good. He never told us what the good thing was. He just kept feeding the can, $1 at a time, for decades. He fixed half the cars on our street for free. If a neighbor's brakes started grinding, Dad would be out there on a Saturday with his hands black to the wrist, waving off gas money like it insulted him. "You don't charge family," he'd say. And he said that about people who weren't family at all. I remember a winter when a single mother 2 blocks over had her alternator die the week before Christmas. She couldn't get to work without the car, and she couldn't afford to fix it. My father brought it into our garage, stayed up past midnight under a work light, and drove it back to her the next morning. When she tried to pay him, he told her the part was on sale. It wasn't. He'd paid for it out of the coffee can and never said a word. My mother, Sandra, has worked in the kitchen of a nursing home for 19 years. She feeds people who won't remember her name by morning, and she learns their names anyway. She knows who likes their toast dark, who can't have salt, who just wants somebody to sit for a minute after the tray is gone. She came home smelling like cafeteria coffee and cinnamon, and she rubbed her feet at the kitchen table every night without ever once saying they hurt. There was a man on her hall, near the end, who had no family left, and my mother sat with him on her own time after her shift so he wouldn't be alone. When he passed, she came home quiet, and the next day she baked something and brought it to the front desk for the nurses, because feeding people was the only language she trusted when words weren't enough. They didn't have much. They just never let anyone around them feel it. When money was thin, my mother made a casserole stretch across 2 dinners and called it a recipe. She had one dish she used for it, a heavy glass Pyrex with a chip on the rim and a faded blue lid that never quite sealed right. That dish has been in our family longer than I have. It has shown up at every funeral, every new baby, every neighbor's bad week. When my mother wants to say I love you and she doesn't have the words for it, she fills that dish and drives it over. I have never once seen her arrive somewhere empty-handed, not one time in 33 years. I do something very different for a living. I'm a recruiter. I place people in jobs at financial firms, which means I spend all day reading resumes and talking to the people behind them. After 12 years, you develop a certain instinct. I can usually tell within 10 minutes when a resume is lying to me, not the small stuff everyone rounds up, but the real gaps, the dates that don't add up, the confidence that's covering for something missing. I once passed on a candidate that a client loved because his timeline had a 6-month hole he kept talking around, and 3 weeks later another firm learned the hard way exactly what he'd been hiding in it. I built a whole career on noticing the thing people are hoping you'll be too polite to notice. I was proud of that. I didn't know yet how close it would come to my own front door. I'm married too. My husband, Adam, is an engineer, a steady, literal man who likes problems that have one clean answer. We've been together 9 years. He grew up a little more comfortable than I did, and early on he made the mistake of buying my father an expensive tool set for Christmas. My dad thanked him, used it exactly once, and quietly went back to the worn-out ratchet he'd had for 30 years. Adam was hurt until I explained, my father doesn't distrust nice things. He distrusts being handed something he didn't earn. That's a distinction Blake never understood, and it's the whole reason this story ends the way it does. A few weeks before the housewarming, my mother pulled me into that same small kitchen and showed me an envelope. Inside was $18,000. "It's for Kelsey," she whispered, like it was a secret gift. "For the down payment on the house. Don't tell her we had to move some things around to do it." I asked where it came from, and she waved her hand, the way she waves off anything that might make her look generous. It came from their retirement. It came from the coffee can and the dark toast and the rubbed feet and 19 years of learning strangers' names. My father stood in the doorway while she showed me, and he said, "She's our girl. You help your girls." That was the whole conversation. It was going toward a house I hadn't even seen yet, for a man I'd met exactly twice. A man who, both times, had left me with a feeling I couldn't name. My sister Kelsey is 5 years younger than me. Growing up, she didn't hate where we came from. She was just always looking over its shoulder at something better. She noticed which girls had newer sneakers. She noticed when the fence needed paint and when our car sounded like our car. She loved our parents, but she loved them the way you love a starting point. A place you plan, someday, to leave. When we were kids and a storm rolled in, she'd climb into my bed and I'd promise her that one day she'd have whatever she wanted. I meant it as comfort. I think she took it as a plan. Then she met Blake, and the looking over the shoulder stopped. She thought she'd finally arrived. I met Blake Caldwell for the first time at a steakhouse Kelsey picked, because it was the kind of place she thought people like Blake ate. He had the kind of confidence that walks into a room before he does. Handsome in a careful, maintained way, always pressed, always reaching for the check before anyone else could get to it. He introduced himself as a senior account executive at Fairmont Group and said it the way some men say their own last name, like the title alone should settle something. He was charming. I'll give him that honestly, because it matters. He asked Kelsey about her day and actually seemed to listen. He made her laugh. When he looked at her, she sat up straighter, and I wanted so badly to be happy for her that I almost missed the rest. But I notice things. It's the job. That first dinner, a young waiter refilled Blake's water and said, "There you go, sir." And Blake didn't look up. Not out of some rudeness he'd ever defend. Just an absence, like the waiter wasn't fully a person. When the check came, he made a show of grabbing it, then tipped exactly what was expected and counted it twice under his hand, where he thought no one could see. And every time I asked him a question about his actual work, he answered about his future instead. I'd ask how Fairmont was going. He'd tell me about the promotion he was up for. I'd ask what he did all day. He'd tell me where he was headed. At the time, I filed it under ambition. Ambitious men talk about the future. It took me almost 2 years to notice that Blake never, not once, talked about the present. Because a man who loves his job tells you a story about a client, and Blake only ever told stories about himself, in a tense that hadn't happened yet. The second time I saw him was at my parents' house. Kelsey brought him for Sunday dinner, and he was polite in the way that costs nothing and means less. He called their home charming. And then, a beat later, "It's got character." He said character the way other people say problem. He asked my father what he used to do, though my father was standing right there, still very much a man who did things every single day. He praised my mother's cooking and left half of it on his plate. On the way out, he told Kelsey, quietly, but I heard it, that the neighborhood had potential. My parents smiled and waved from the porch. They liked him because Kelsey liked him. That was enough for them. It was never going to be enough for me, but I kept my mouth shut. Because that's what you do when you want to keep the peace, and your sister is finally happy. They got engaged in June of last year. Kelsey called me at 7 in the morning, screaming with joy, and told me the whole proposal 3 times in a row. I said all the right things, and I meant most of them. By this spring, they were closing on a house. She called me again, breathless, to tell me she'd qualified for the mortgage on her own. Her income as a dental hygienist, her savings, her name on all the paperwork. Blake said to keep it in my name for now. She added, cleaner that way. He'll get added after the wedding. Cleaner. I remember lying awake later, turning that one word over in the dark. She drove a paid-off Corolla with a dent in the bumper and put nearly everything she had into that house, and Blake drove a leased BMW and put in almost nothing, and somehow, at every dinner, the story everyone told was that Blake had made all of this happen. I noticed. I said nothing. In early April, I finally almost broke my silence. I didn't have proof of anything, just a feeling. The house being a stretch. Blake being a fog whenever real money came up. I called Kelsey and asked, as gently as I knew how, "Are you sure about all of this? The house? The timing? All of it at once?" There was a pause, and then her voice went hard in a way I'd never heard from my little sister. "Not everyone gets a Blake, Ellie, please. Just stay out of it." So I did. I hung up, told myself it wasn't my life, and stopped asking. That was my mistake, and I've had to live with it. Because if I'd pushed a little harder that day, maybe it wouldn't have taken 40 witnesses to finally reach her. Then, the week of the housewarming, I found his name in a candidate list at work. I wasn't even the recruiter on the search. My firm, Brightwater Talent, was running a placement for a director of sales role at Halcyon Capital, and I was reviewing the shared pipeline for a colleague who was out sick when a name stopped me cold on the screen. Blake Caldwell. My sister's fiancé, sitting right there in the candidate pool for a job I suddenly realized was the perfect future he kept toasting to at every family dinner. I opened his resume the way you'd touch a stove to see if it's actually hot. Senior Account Executive, Fairmont Group, 2019, present. Present. That was the first lie, and it was sitting there in 12-point font because I already knew what had happened at Fairmont in February. I'd heard it through the same small, gossiping network that hears everything in this city eventually. So I called an old contact of mine who'd stayed close to that firm, and I asked, carefully, and he answered without a second of hesitation. The whole desk, back in February, big restructure. Caldwell too. Why? No reason, I said. There was every reason in the world. Blake hadn't worked at Fairmont in months, and that week he was planning to host a housewarming and stand up in front of everyone he knew and toast a future he no longer had. And suddenly a small, nagging thing from a month earlier clicked into place. I'd seen Blake once on a Tuesday, mid-morning, at a coffee shop near my office, sitting alone in a full suit with a laptop and a legal pad. When I'd waved, he'd told me he was between meetings, working remote today, and I'd thought nothing of it. Now I understood what I'd actually been looking at. A man who put on a suit every morning so my sister would watch him leave for a job he didn't have, then drove somewhere to sit for 8 hours and pretend. He'd been doing it for weeks. The whole time she was picking out paint colors. That image bothered me more than the resume did. The resume was a lie he told other people. The suit was a lie he told himself. The moment I recognized his name, I did the only thing I could do and still look at myself in the mirror. I flagged the conflict of interest, recused myself from the search, and handed the file back. I don't get to read a private candidate record out loud at a dinner party. That's not who I am. It isn't legal, and it isn't right. And I wasn't going to become Blake to expose Blake. But there was one more thing I already knew, and I couldn't unknow it. Earlier that same week, the halcyon role had been given to another candidate. The corner office Blake kept describing, the base salary he'd once bragged would change everything, $185,000 a year, it had gone to someone else. My sister believed he was starting there next month. He'd been turned down that same week. That night I told my husband all of it, sitting at our own kitchen table with cold coffee going colder. So don't go, Adam said in his clean, one-answer way. Send a gift. Stay out of it, like she asked you to. For a second I wanted to. If I say nothing, I said, she buys an entire life with a man who's lying to her about everything, and she does it with my parents' retirement. He was quiet for a long moment. And if you say something, he said slowly, you're the sister who blew up her party. She'll blame you, not him. You know that, right? I know, I said. That's the part I keep landing on. I didn't sleep much that week. I kept telling myself I was being unfair, that maybe there was an explanation, that maybe I'd misread the screen. I kept adding it up and hoping the total would come out different. It never did. There was one night I stood in our hallway at 2 a.m. and almost talked myself out of the whole thing. Who was I to detonate my sister's happiness? Maybe Blake would land somewhere before the wedding? Maybe it would sort itself out? And then I thought about my mother's envelope, and about the baby I didn't yet know was coming, and I understood something plain and hard. Silence hadn't protected anyone. It had just let the lie get bigger. Staying quiet in April was why I was standing in a hallway at 2 a.m. in the first place. If I stayed quiet again, I already knew exactly how it would go. The wedding, the second house, the second envelope. My parents quietly emptying a coffee can for a man who'd never once looked them in the eye. So I made a decision. I wouldn't ambush him. I'd give him one chance, a private, human chance, to tell the truth himself. If he took it, I'd help them both quietly, and no one would ever have to know what I knew. If he didn't, I'd stop protecting a lie that was hollowing out my whole family. Just one chance. That felt fair. That felt like the most my parents' daughter could do, and still be my parents' daughter. Then the invitation came, and Kelsey's voice on the phone was so happy I almost let all of it go. Just bring yourselves, she told our parents. My mother made a casserole anyway, in the same chipped Pyrex, because she always brings what she has. My father ironed his good shirt twice and asked me, if it looked all right. It looked like a man who cared what my sister's new friends would think of him, which broke my heart a little. I drove over that Saturday knowing more than anyone in that house, and hoping the whole way there that I was somehow wrong about Blake. I wasn't. Before I take you inside, one quick thing. If you've ever watched someone make your mom or dad feel small in a room where they didn't belong, you already know the weight I was carrying up that driveway. Tell me about it in the comments. The quietest, most dignified thing your parents ever did when the world tried to make them feel less than. I read every single one of them. The house sat at the end of a new subdivision, all beige siding and young trees staked to the ground so the wind wouldn't take them before they'd rooted. Inside, everything gleamed. The kitchen island was the size of my parents' dining room, a single slab of granite, and Blake stood behind it like a man behind a podium. There were maybe 40 guests, catered trays under warming lamps, a bar cart with a hired bartender, and Blake at the center of all of it, giving a little tour, telling the story of the house as though he'd poured the foundation with his own hands. He greeted me with a smile that didn't reach anything. He had no idea what I'd brought with me, and it wasn't wrapped. My mother came in a few steps behind me, holding her dish with both hands the way she always does, careful and a little proud. She found Blake and offered it up. I made my casserole, honey. Where would you like it? Blake looked at the Pyrex. The chip, the faded lid, the foil crimped over the top, and something crossed his face, quick and cold. "We'll put this back here," he said, and slid it to the far end of the counter, behind the wine, where nobody would see it. My mother's smile did a small, terrible thing. It held, and then it thinned, and then she folded her hands and pretended she hadn't noticed a thing. My father noticed. He didn't say anything. That's the thing about my dad. He never does. Not at first. I watched Blake walk two neighbors around the great room, pointing at the ceiling height, and then he came back through the kitchen, and it happened. He stopped, looked my parents up and down, my mother's soft gray cardigan, my father's carefully ironed shirt, and said it. Loud enough. "You should have left them home. They make this place look cheap." A woman near the window, one of Kelsey's co-workers named Renee, turned her head sharply. She'd heard it too. I watched her hear it, and my sister laughed. She actually laughed. A light, smoothing over laugh. And then she put a hand on our mother's arm and said, "Mom, don't make it weird, okay?" That sentence did more damage than anything Blake said all night. Because Blake was a stranger to us, really. A man performing a life. But Kelsey was ours. She was the storm nights and the whispered promises. "It's fine, honey," my mother said softly. And it wasn't fine. And she said it anyway. For Kelsey. So the party could go on. My father folded his hands. Those big scarred hands that had fixed 100 strangers' cars for nothing. That had stayed up past midnight so a woman he'd never met could get to work. And he looked down at his shoes in a house he had helped pay for. My mother stood very straight and very still, the way she does when she's decided not to cause a scene at somebody else's party. I felt something go cold and clear in the center of my chest. My hand was actually halfway to setting my glass down, and then I stopped myself, because I already knew that whatever I said in that moment would just become a story about wine and a jealous sister. I didn't have enough yet. I needed him to keep talking. The more he said, the less he'd be able to take back. So I watched, and I listened to every lie he told. "We're closing a huge quarter at Fairmont," he told a neighbor, wine glass tilting. "We?" I kept thinking. With what team, Blake? He talked about clients he didn't have and deadlines that didn't exist. He dropped a colleague's first name into a sentence. Casual, like they'd just hung up the phone. Every time he said the firm's name in the present tense, it was like watching a man describe a house he'd been evicted from as though he still had the keys. He was completely fluent in it. That was the frightening part. The lie didn't seem to cost him anything at all. Out front, the leased BMW sat in the driveway, and I heard him call it his company car when a guest admired it. Fairmont doesn't give account executives company cars, and Fairmont didn't employ him anyway. The $780 a month lie parked in the driveway where everyone could see it. Kelsey drifted past just then and caught me looking at it. "The payment's a lot," she admitted, almost apologetic, almost like she was asking me to tell her it was fine. "But it's worth it." Her money, not his. I just nodded and let it go, for the moment. Earlier, Blake had given a few of the guests a tour, and I'd trailed along at the edge of it. He walked them past the island and told them the countertops were imported, that they'd gone over budget on purpose because you only do this once. He pointed out the wine fridge, the smart thermostat, a light fixture over the stairs he called a statement piece. Every upgrade had a price attached, said out loud, casually, the way some people can't help doing. My parents drifted at the back of the little group, my father nodding politely at a house he'd helped make possible, my mother saying, "It's lovely, Kelsey, really," to a daughter who was already 3 rooms ahead. At one point, a guest asked my father what he thought of the crown molding, and before he could answer, Blake cut in. "Wayne's more of a hands-on guy, aren't you, Wayne?" and steered the group toward the patio. My father closed his mouth and looked at the molding a moment longer, the way a craftsman studies work, and then followed everyone out. He knew more about how that house was actually built than any man in it. Nobody asked him a single thing. I kept a quiet inventory in my head all night, the way I do at work when a candidate's story starts drifting. Everything in that house was borrowed against a future that didn't exist. The imported counters, the statement light, the catering, the champagne in every hand. All of it sat on top of a joint account, a maxed card, and $18,000 from a coffee can. Blake was standing in a house of debt telling the room he'd overspent on purpose, and the two people who'd actually paid for a piece of it were being walked to the back of every conversation. I hadn't decided yet exactly what I was going to do, but I was done pretending I couldn't see it. That's when a man I didn't recognize walked up to Blake near the island. An easy, friendly guy, maybe 40, holding a beer. "Nathan," he said, introducing himself to our little cluster. "Just moved in. 2 doors down. Great party." Then he turned to Blake with a warm, clumsy smile, the smile of a neighbor making small talk. "Hey, good to see you back on your feet after the cuts. Rough winter over at Fairmont, huh? Glad it worked out for you." Blake's smile flickered for exactly 1 second. He changed the subject fast. Too fast. Steering Nathan toward the bar with a hand on his shoulder. But it was already too late. Nathan and I had looked at each other across the granite, and in that half-second we both understood that we knew the same thing. A little while later, I found Nathan by the window and asked, lightly, how he knew Blake. He'd worked at Fairmont until last year, he said, before he took a job somewhere steadier. "February," he told me, keeping his voice low, glancing around the room. "They cut the whole desk. Blake included. I just assumed Kelsey knew. Figured he landed somewhere by now." "He didn't," I said. "And she doesn't know any of it." His face changed. He looked over at Kelsey laughing near the cake, then back at me, and he had the decency to look genuinely uncomfortable. "I really don't want to be in the middle of anything," he said. "You won't have to be," I told him. And I meant it. But it also meant I wasn't the only person in that house holding the truth anymore. There was a witness. And the party was about to toast a lie in front of everyone. I found my sister a few minutes later, alone for a second, glowing. She grabbed my hand. "He starts at Halcyon next month, Ellie," she whispered, so proud it physically hurt to hear. "Director. Everything's about to change for us." She was toasting a future that had already told him no, and she didn't know it, and she was looking at me like she wanted me to be proud right along with her. I opened my mouth to warn her, gently, right there, and then she said the thing that changed the shape of the entire night. "We're having a baby." She pressed my hand flat against her stomach, her eyes wet and shining. "Don't tell anyone yet, okay? We used almost everything on the house, but Blake says once the director money starts, it'll all be fine." And just like that, the lie had a due date. I looked at my little sister's happy, trusting face, and I understood something I'd been letting myself avoid all week. This was no longer only about money, or pride, or a man who was rude at dinner. There was going to be a child standing in the middle of all of it. I could not let this go. Not now. I still gave him his one chance. I found Blake by the sliding glass door, a fresh drink in his hand, that easy confidence back on his face. "How's Fairmont treating you these days?" I asked, as neutral as I could make it. It was a door. All he had to do was walk through it. He could have told me the truth. I lost my job in February, Ellie, and I've been too scared to tell her. And I would have helped him find a way to make it right, quietly, tonight, before it ever became this. "Couldn't be better," he said, smiling, swirling his glass. "Big things coming." And the door closed. Then he did something worse. He leaned in, warming to his favorite subject, and described the Halcyon job to me in detail. The corner office on the 4th floor, the start date, the team he'd be building, the number on the offer. A job I had personally watched them give to another candidate that very week. He looked me right in the eye, my sister's fiancé, the father of the baby she just told me about, and he invented every word of it, fluently, without a single crack. There's a specific kind of cold you feel when you catch someone lying to your face about a thing you know for a fact. I gave him his one chance, and he spent it lying to me over a glass of my sister's champagne. I stepped away for a second and texted Adam from the corner of the kitchen. "Am I really about to do this?" I wrote. His reply came fast. "You already gave him the chance. That was the fair part. This is just the true part." I looked up from the phone, and Blake was getting bolder. Emboldened by his own performance, he gestured toward my father, who was standing by the counter, quietly trying to disappear, and said to a small group of guests, "Careful leaning on those counters. He's still got grease under those nails." A couple of people laughed politely because they didn't know what else to do with it. Kelsey giggled. My father set down the plate he'd been holding, very gently, and went to find their coats. A few minutes before that, I'd watched my mother try to make herself useful the only way she knows how. She'd slipped behind the island, found a stack of dirty plates, and started rinsing them at the sink. Quietly, the way she does at every gathering she's ever been to. Kelsey noticed and hurried over. "Mom, no, we have people for that tonight," she said, taking the plate out of her hands. Not unkindly but firmly, the way you'd redirect a child. "Just relax, okay? Enjoy yourself." My mother dried her hands on a dish towel that wasn't hers and stepped back against the wall, and she smiled, and for a second she looked like she didn't know what to do with her own hands in a room where being useful had been taken away from her. That was the smallest cruelty of the whole night, and no one but me even saw it happen. For one long moment I doubted myself. I looked at Kelsey, flushed and happy and hosting, and I thought, what if I'm about to take this from her? And she never forgives me, and I turn out to be the villain in the only version of this night she'll ever tell. What if silence really was the kinder thing? Then my mother caught my eye from across the kitchen and gave me a small private smile. The one that says, "Don't, sweetheart. It's fine, let it go. It's her day." And I understood that she would absorb any amount of this to protect Kelsey's happiness, that she'd been quietly absorbing it her whole life, and that if I let her keep absorbing it, nothing would ever change. Her willingness to take the hit was the exact reason someone else finally had to refuse to let her. He came to me near the hallway, my mother's coat already folded over his arm. "We'll head out, sweetheart," he said. His voice was soft, and there was no anger in it, which was somehow worse than anger. "We don't want to make trouble on Kelsey's big day." He was still protecting her. Even now, after all of it, he was worried about her party. And that quiet, bottomless decency was the exact moment I decided. He would not stand there and humiliate them and then walk away clean, toasting his perfect future while my parents drove home in the dark. Not tonight. Not with what I knew. I stood by the island and did the math one final time, because I needed to be certain I wasn't the cruel one. $18,000 from my parents' retirement. My sister's savings, nearly all of it. A baby on the way. A job that didn't exist and had already said no. A car he couldn't afford. A house in her name only. A company that had let him go in the winter. This was not a rude man having a bad night. This was a man spending my family's money to look like someone he wasn't, and making my parents feel small so that his illusion could feel big. I set my drink down on the granite. My hands were steady. I have never in my life felt more calm than I did in the next 60 seconds. Then Blake tapped a knife against his glass. "Everyone, gather round, he called, delighted, and the room turned toward him like flowers toward a lamp. He wanted an audience. I was about to give him one he would never forget. He raised his glass over that granite island, and the overhead light caught it, and he looked around the room like a man surveying everything he'd earned. "To this house," he said, warm and easy. To this beautiful family. And to my perfect future. He paused, letting it settle over the room. Thank you to everyone in here who matters. He didn't look at my parents once. Not one single time. My mother was standing 8 feet from him, and he toasted the people who mattered without letting his eyes so much as brush across her face. He raised the glass higher, and I raised my voice, quietly. Before we toast, I said, we need to talk about your employment. 40 people went still at exactly the same moment. Kelsey's smile froze halfway to her face. Blake laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and glanced around as if inviting the room to laugh along with him at his silly sister-in-law. Ellie, come on, this really isn't the time. It's exactly the time, I said. I wasn't loud. I didn't need to be. In a silent room, calm is the loudest thing there is. He recovered fast, the way he always did, and turned to the crowd with a practiced, forgiving little shrug. My future sister-in-law's had a bit of wine, he said, and a few guests chuckled, uncertain, wanting the tension to resolve into a joke. I'm a senior exec at Fairmont, starting as director over at Halcyon next month. That's the boring truth of it. He smiled at his own boredom, at his own reasonableness, so sure of himself. Then let's start with Fairmont, I said, still level. When did you last actually work there, Blake? For the first time all night, he didn't have a smile ready. Ellie, he started, but I kept going, calm and clear, the way you read a number off a page. You were part of the February layoffs, the whole desk. You haven't worked at Fairmont in months. I wasn't reading a file, I didn't need one. I was simply saying a true thing out loud, and half the power of a lie is that no one ever says the true thing in front of everyone. People had been letting Blake talk for 1.5 years. I just stopped letting him. You're confused, Blake said. But his voice had changed. The ease had drained out of it. And then, near the bar, a man cleared his throat. Every head in the room turned toward Nathan. He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on the planet. He set his beer down on the cart, glanced at Kelsey, and said it, quietly. Because it was true, and because someone had asked him a direct question in a silent room. Fairmont cut the whole desk. Back in February, Blake was on it. I was there for it. A murmur moved through the guests, low, like a draft finding a gap under a door. Kelsey's hand shot out and grabbed Blake's arm. Tell them that's not true, she said, and her voice climbed on the last word. Blake, tell them it isn't true. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He couldn't do it. My sister stood in the middle of her own beautiful kitchen, waiting for the man she loved to deny it, and he simply stood there. And the silence where his answer should have been was the loudest confession I have ever heard in my life. Around the room, the party rearranged itself in small, silent ways. A couple near the door set their glasses down on a side table and reached for their coats. Renee had stopped pretending to look at her phone. An older woman I didn't know put a hand over her mouth. 2 of Blake's friends, the ones who'd laughed hardest at his jokes all evening, found something fascinating to study on the floor. Nobody was looking at me. They were all looking at Blake. Waiting. The way you wait to see if a man who's been caught will finally just admit it. He didn't. His eyes moved from Kelsey to the door and back, calculating, and I watched him understand that the room was already gone. I let the room feel that. I didn't rush it. Then I closed the last door, gently, because I was not going to read anyone's private records to a crowd of strangers. And that director job you just toasted? I said. There's no offer, Blake. There never was. He didn't argue. He couldn't produce an offer letter he didn't have, and every person in that kitchen could watch the truth of it move across his face. A man with an offer says the name of the person who called him. Blake said nothing at all. Then I turned away from him, because the person who mattered now was not Blake. It was my sister. He hasn't worked since February, Kel, I said, and my voice dropped, softer than it had been all night. the house, the car, the catering. Tonight. Where do you think all of it came from? Her eyes went to our parents. And my mother, my quiet, careful mother, who had apologized an hour earlier just for existing in that room, stepped forward into the center of that gleaming kitchen. "It's all right, Kelsey," she said, and her voice was steady and warm. "We just wanted to help you. That's all it ever was, sweetheart." And I watched my sister understand, all at once, exactly whose retirement had paid for the granite she was leaning against. That's when Blake lost the last of it. "You've ruined everything," he shouted, and the Polish was finally, completely gone. His face was ugly with it now. "I did this family a favor. Look where they came from. You think a man like me was supposed to end up—" He caught himself a half-second too late, but the sentence was already loose in the room, hanging there for every single person to hear. And the guests didn't recoil from us. They recoiled from him. Renee crossed the floor without a word and took my mother's hand. She had decided, right there, in front of everyone, who in that house was cheap. Blake stood in the middle of his perfect kitchen, breathing hard, and not one person moved to his side. Not one. And into all that silence, my mother walked to the far end of the counter, behind the wine where he'd hidden it, and picked up her casserole dish. She carried it the whole length of that enormous kitchen and set it down in the exact center of the granite island, the chipped Pyrex, the faded blue lid, right in the middle of everything he'd spent the night showing off. "We brought what we had," she said softly, to no one and to everyone at once. "We always do." My sister looked at that worn old dish sitting on her flawless counter, and she finally broke. The party emptied the way people leave the scene of an accident, quietly, quickly, no one meeting anyone's eyes on the way to the door. A few guests touched my mother's shoulder as they passed. One older neighbor shook my father's hand on the way out and said, "Good to meet you, Wayne," with a kind of deliberate respect. Within 20 minutes, the bartender was the only stranger left, wiping down a cart nobody was using. Blake had disappeared into a back room. Kelsey turned on me first, her face streaked and furious. "Why would you do that? Here, in front of everyone I know?" I didn't defend myself. I just said the true thing, the way I had all night. "I tried to tell you 3 weeks ago," I said. "You told me to stay out of it." She went completely still. I watched her remember the phone call, the way she'd cut me off, the exact words she'd used. Stay out of it. She had asked me to look away, and I had. And the looking away was a big part of how she'd ended up here. It wasn't an accusation. It was just the truth. And by then, we both understood that the truth was the only thing in that entire house that hadn't been staged for company. Then Blake came back into the room with a brand new story already loaded and ready to fire. "Kelsey, I was going to tell you," he said, and his voice was smooth again, warm, reaching for her hands. "After the baby. I didn't want to stress you out in your condition. I've got leads, real ones, and this is all temporary. I promise you." It was so polished, so instantly and effortlessly ready, that my sister finally saw the thing underneath the thing. Not one lie, caught on a bad night. A whole life of them, kept in a drawer, one always queued up and waiting for the moment the last one collapsed. "Where's the baby money, Blake?" she asked. He hesitated. And in that hesitation, every one of us heard the answer. They had set aside $9,000 in a joint account for the baby. She told me the number later, at my parents' kitchen table, in a voice I'd never heard from her before. When she checked the account that night, $2,500 was left. He had spent the rest keeping the show running. The car, the party, the catering. The whole glossy version of himself the world was supposed to believe in. My sister's hand went to her stomach. "Get out," she said. 2 words. And Blake, who had always had one more sentence ready for every occasion, finally ran completely out of them. My parents didn't gloat. That's simply not in them. My father crossed the room and put his hands on Kelsey's shoulders, those big scarred hands, and he said the thing I'll carry with me the rest of my life. A house doesn't make a life, sweetheart. The people who show up for you do. My mother wrapped both arms around her, and for the first time in years, actual years, my sister let our mother hold her while she cried, right there in the wreckage of her perfect party, with the casserole dish sitting on the island like the only honest object in the entire building. If you've ever had to be the one who said the true thing out loud when staying quiet would have been so much easier, then you already know it doesn't feel like winning. It feels like breaking something on purpose to keep it from breaking worse later. Have you ever had to protect your family from someone they loved? I'd honestly like to hear about it below, and stay with me, because what happened over the next few weeks surprised even me. Here's what I need to be clear about, because it matters more than the drama of that night. I did not get Blake fired. I couldn't have. There was no job to fire him from. That was the entire point of everything. I didn't destroy his career at a party. His own resume did that. The one that still said present next to a firm that had let him go in the dead of winter. This is a small city, in a small industry, and a lie like his only has to be told once before it starts walking around on its own 2 feet. 2 firms he'd been quietly courting went cold within the month. Nobody blacklisted him. There was no dramatic phone call, no committee, no scene. It was quieter and far more permanent than that. When people in the business learned he'd been claiming a job he didn't have and an offer he'd never actually received, they simply stopped answering his emails. A man is only as employable as the last true thing anyone can say about him, and the last true thing about Blake had gotten around. He texted me once, about 3 weeks later. No apology. I don't think Blake has ever apologized for anything in his life. Just a long message about how I'd humiliated him, ruined a good thing, how Kelsey and I would regret this. And halfway through, without seeming to notice the contradiction, he mentioned that he had 3 offers on the table and was fielding calls from firms that actually appreciate talent. Even then, cornered and gone, he was still doing it. Still inventing a future? Still selling a version of himself to an audience of one. I didn't reply. There was nothing true in the message to answer. I just read it and thought about how exhausting it must be. Being Blake, keeping all those stories in the air at once. Never getting to set them down and just be a man who lost his job and got scared. It was almost enough to make me feel sorry for him. Almost. I need to be just as clear about myself, because it would be easy to tell this story and make myself the hero with the secret files. The moment I saw his name in that pipeline, I recused. I never opened a record I wasn't allowed to open. At the party, I said only the 2 things I could stand behind in the daylight, that he'd been laid off, which half the industry already knew, and that there was no offer, which he could not dispute. And I let a witness and his own silence carry the rest. When my manager heard how it had happened, and in a business this small she heard within days, she agreed there was nothing improper about any of it. There wasn't. The hardest part of that whole night was never telling the truth. The hardest part was watching my little sister learn it in front of 40 people who used to wave to her in the grocery store. Kelsey called off the engagement within the week. She could technically carry the house on her own. Barely, with the baby coming and the savings gone. But she didn't want a life that reminded her of that night every single time she walked into her own kitchen. A few weeks later, a for sale sign went up in the yard of the perfect house. Someday soon that granite island would belong to a stranger who'd never know its story. My mother's casserole dish, though, that came home first. The very next morning, washed and dried and back up on its shelf as though nothing at all had happened. Kelsey tried to pay our parents back. She sat at their kitchen table with a spiral notebook and an actual plan, insisting she'd return every dollar of the $18,000 monthly, with interest if they'd let her. I'm paying you back, she said, All of it, I mean it this time. My mother put a hand flat over the notebook. You don't owe us money, Kelsey, she said. You never did. Because the money had never been what they lost, and it was never the thing they were hoping to get back. It cost me something too, and I want to be honest about that, because these stories tend to leave that part out. For a few weeks, Kelsey barely spoke to me. Some of her friends who'd been at the party decided I was the cruel one, the sister who couldn't let her have a single good day. I heard secondhand that one of them called what I did unhinged. There were nights I lay awake wondering whether I'd been right or just righteous. Being the person who says the true thing is not the same as being the person anyone thanks. Nobody threw me a party for it, and I didn't want one. But I'd be lying if I said the silence from my sister those first weeks didn't sit on my chest like a stone. Doing the right thing and feeling good about it are two very different experiences, and anyone who tells you otherwise has never had to do the hard one. A few Sundays later, we were all at my parents' small house again, gathered around the kitchen table with the wobble my father has never fixed and swears he never will, because he says a table that shifts a little keeps everyone at it honest. Kelsey was there, quieter than I'd seen her in years, a little rounder now, carrying dishes to the sink beside our mother. And there, back in its rightful place on the counter, was the Pyrex, full again, in use again, exactly where it belonged. After dinner, my sister asked if the two of us could talk. Just us. We sat on the back step in the cooling evening air. For a while, neither of us said anything at all. Then she said, I keep thinking about how I laughed. Her voice cracked on the word laughed. He said that about Mom and Dad, and my first thought wasn't, how could you? My first thought was, please don't ruin this for me. That's who I'd turned into, Ellie, and I didn't even notice it happening. I didn't rush to comfort her, because a real apology needs room to be true, and I'd learned the hard way what happens when you smooth things over too fast. I'm not sorry I said something, I told her finally. I'm sorry it had to happen like that, in front of everyone. I know, she said. I think I needed it to be like that. I don't believe anything quieter would have actually reached me. She turned to face me on the step. I'm sorry, Ellie. Not that you got hurt. That I chose him over them. Over you. I did that. Nobody made me do it, and I want to earn my way back, however long that takes and whatever it looks like. It wasn't everything. We weren't repaired in a single evening on a back step, and I didn't pretend to her that we were. But it was honest, and specific, and it named the actual thing she had done instead of the softer version. And honest was new. A couple of Sundays after that, I came over and found Kelsey in the kitchen with our mother, an apron on, the chipped Pyrex on the counter between them. Mom was teaching her the casserole, the real one, the two-dinner one, the recipe that was never written down anywhere because it lived in my mother's hands. Kelsey kept getting the layering wrong and laughing at herself, and my mother kept saying, no, no, like this, watch, guiding her fingers, patient as anything. I stood in the doorway and didn't say a word because I didn't want to break it. My sister, who had spent her whole life looking over her shoulder at something better, was standing in our mother's kitchen learning to make the cheapest, most ordinary dish in the world, and she was happier than I'd seen her in the granite house on its very best day. She was learning the one thing that couldn't be repossessed. When it came out of the oven, she carried it to the table with both hands, careful and a little proud, exactly the way our mother does, and something in my chest that had been clenched since the party finally let go. Later, drying dishes at the sink, my father said the thing that finally put the whole night to rest inside me. He was holding a plate, working the towel over it slow. Cheap isn't a countertop, he said, not really to anyone in particular. Cheap is a man who lets other people pay for his life and then calls them small. And I realized that the cheapest thing in that entire beautiful house had been standing behind the granite island the whole evening, and it was never, Not for one single second, my parents. Kelsey moved into a small apartment about 10 minutes from mom and dad, a plain place with thin carpet and surprisingly good light in the afternoons. On moving day, my mother pressed the Pyrex dish into her hands, the chipped one, the one Blake had shoved behind the wine. "For when you have people over," she said, "the real ones." My sister held it like it was worth more than all the granite in that subdivision, and I think that finally she understood that it was. She's due later this year. She's decided to keep the baby close to family, and my father has already started fixing up a used crib somebody was throwing away, sanding it down in the garage under the work light, humming. For the first time in her entire life, my sister has a home that isn't pretending to be something it isn't. I still think about that toast. "To my perfect future," he said, over a house he didn't pay for, in front of the parents he'd just called cheap, holding a glass he couldn't actually afford. You can tell almost everything about a person by how they treat the people who can do nothing for them. My parents brought a casserole in a chipped dish because that is what love looks like when it has nothing to prove and isn't trying to prove anything. Blake brought a mortgage he couldn't cover and a future that didn't exist. And he spent the entire night making sure everyone in the room understood how much better he was than the two quiet people who were funding his whole life. So let me ask you honestly, would you forgive a sister who laughed? Or did she lose something in that moment that a person can't fully earn back, no matter how sorry they are later? I genuinely don't think there's a wrong answer, and I'd like to read yours. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about your own family, your own parents, the times you did or didn't say something when it counted, then subscribe and stick around a while. There's always another one worth telling. And I do like knowing you're out there.